All right, so welcome back to what is now part 2 of our overview and analysis of ancient Sumer. In this video, we're going to talk a little bit more about the culture, the way of life of the Sumerian people, as well as some of their societal structures. And you'll notice that a lot of the things that we're going to talk about in this video are not necessarily unique to the Sumerians. They're not even necessarily unique to the people of Mesopotamia or the Middle East. It's just that this is the first place that a lot of these structures wind up kind of coming into existence. And because of that, they set a framework for what a lot of future societies are going to pick up as their culture, as their societal structures. And a lot of this has to do with the fact that, there are people who either observe and copy these things, they find them useful. The things that are not useful are going to wind up dying off, at least if they're not useful for the people who are making use of them. So when I think about a culture, a lot of times the first thing that I think of is the aesthetics, and where more technically culture is defined as just the way of life of a group of people. I think that aesthetics gives you a insight into what these people think of themselves, their place in the universe, their place among the gods, daily, maybe more mundane rituals that they have to go through, and then even you think more high annual ceremonial religious obligations that they have. This is going to teach you about the way that they dress, the way that men and women would interact with each other. So a culture is kind of broad to try to define, and then but if we're looking just at the aesthetics of Sumeria, you get a lot of beige. So, I can go back to this slide, and we have kind of some aesthetic examples from Indian culture, Egyptian culture, Greek culture, Chinese culture, and it shows you the way that they dressed, a little bit about the way that they interacted with each other. And obviously, you'd have to look at more than just these 4 examples, one example from each culture. But in Sumeria, again, we kind of presume that there's a lot of beige, and that might be due to the fact that archaeologists, when they uncover things that are clay-colored and sand-colored and stone-colored, and not necessarily dyed or painted in the bright and vibrant colors that they would have been observed as for the actual people who lived in this culture. So we see that, like I said, a lot of the things that they set up wind up becoming the norm for at least the Middle East, if not kind of broadening out into, you can go into Persian and then Indian or Greek and then broader European cultures. When I think of culture, I think it's really helpful to think of a few things, which is how do people dress, what art do they pay attention to, and then what do they eat? These are just kind of some simple markers. So if I'm talking about American culture, then I might think of like jeans and a t-shirt. I might think of the types of movies that are popular, that have high grossing box office success, performance, and then the type of food that is very popular, that is most eaten among the people. Now, there's always high culture and low culture, but if I'm thinking of Sumeria, I'm thinking of at least the way that they represent, that they dress. It's you dress for climate, you dress for the job, you dress for, to not be impeded from getting things done, and also so that the heat doesn't kill you. When I think of the stories that they pay attention to, I think most notably of the Epic of Gilgamesh. We'll talk a lot actually about that in the next lecture. And then when I think of the food that they ate, it's just kind of what's available. So you have a lot of bread, a lot of beer. These are things that can be created from wheat, from grain, and that is the staple crop. There are other food sources, vegetables that are listed. You can look up cookbooks and recipes even from ancient Sumerian culture, and you see that they have onions and leek and carrot and shallot and a lot of other vegetables. But the staple crops, the staple food for the hoi polloi, the normal people, is going to be bread, and the staple drink, obviously you're going to be drinking water, but then also beer that is brewed, and it is therefore maybe safer to drink than some of the sources of water from the area. And then also it helps the society because it is a soporific. It kind of makes the slave class, the lower class, the working class, more manageable, and it's easier to keep them subdued if they poison their minds, if they were to just kind of relax, take it easy at the end of the day, instead of thinking about the things that you might not want them thinking about if you want to keep them where they are, keep society, quote, functioning, end quote. If I think of the societal structures in the United States, or really just in modern civilization, and you think of the fact that we have a division of labor, not just a written language, which I think has got to be considered a precursor if you want to be considered a civilization, not just a written language, but a written law code. We saw a little bit about that with Namu in the last talk. A structure of civil government, whatever that might be. Most of the time, especially in ancient history, it's going to be pretty autocratic, pretty centralized, localized, monarchic, even though we do see examples of direct and indirect democracy, so republics, things like that, with Rome and ancient Greece. And, the art that they revere. Again, I think, a civilization is going to create art that's no longer necessarily just an oral tradition, but maybe sculpted, maybe performed in plays, definitely at least written down. And then also the role that technology plays. For us, we have smartphones and spaceships. For them, even just an invention as simple as a plow would have really changed the way that they interact with the world. So again, if I'm thinking of the division of labor, I talked about how you have this hierarchical structure that it's not even just unique to ancient cultures. Like pretty much all societies, I should say all societies, they have people at the top who have more power, more resources, and then people who are more of a servile class, people who today we talk about working class, and at least in America where I live, that's pretty much everybody. Pretty much everybody has to have a job in order to survive, even if it's a white-collar job, even if you're a lawyer or a doctor. Not a lot of people would be able to survive without having to work. But at least in ancient cultures, you have more of an aristocratic class that would be given maybe entirely to just leisure. They would have managerial duties that are important and don't need to be taken lightly, but they would have a lot of time for these more ceremonial things that they were doing, either to please the god, to please the lugal, which just means big man. It's the king or the leader of such a society. And so you see this in the standard of Ur. Remember the city of Ur. This artifact shows us kind of the tiered level of society, where on the top you have the king, the lugal. That's either the second or third guy to the left, depending on what exactly that thing is, all the way in the top left. You can tell because he's bigger than everybody else. And then his family, his friends, and then you do have people who are serving them, either serving them cups of wine or beer. You have people who are playing music, entertaining them, and then the lower levels of society, you have those who are dealing with animals, those who are bearing burdens. And again, this is something that we're just going to acknowledge is always the case. If you were to think about the classes, kind of like how we have, in societies, you have the ruling class, you have maybe like a middle class who are wealthy, and then a lower or a working class. If you're talking specifically about ancient Sumeria or ancient Mesopotamia, then you have the king, the lugal, who is at the top, and then his family, which would be the royal class, the nobles, which are either the king's extended family or friends, people who have done specific favors for him, maybe very successful generals or administrators who have been elevated to a status of nobility so that their positions would no longer be positions that are necessarily earned by the merit of the people who are able to perform the job, but really just given to the children of the people who had earned that favor with the king. Under that, you would have commoners and clients. These are people who have a little bit more control over the direction of their labor and the use of their resources. And then, as in almost all societies throughout history, you would have a slave class who would not be in control of their own, the direction of their labor or the use of their resources. A lot of times not even being able to own property and being considered property themselves. We hear talk in ancient cultures of the fact that you have dumb tools, which would be something like an axe. You have semi-sentient tools, which would be perhaps like an ox that you would use to plow, and then you have sentient tools, which would be your slaves, things that can be people who could be talked to and directed and given a little bit more complex tasks, but nevertheless were not in control of the direction of their labor, and they could either be conquered peoples. So we see that when the Akkadians take over and establish their empire under Sargon, they don't take over societies where everybody's already equal, or at least middle class, able to direct their own labor. They take over societies where people are already enslaved. And these might have been hunter-gatherers or other smaller agrarian cultures that had surrounded the city of Uruk or of Nippur or wherever. But now that Sargon and the Akkadians are in charge, they're going to enslave a lot of the other people, take away their power from them, bind them both socially and literally, in order to maintain power and influence for themselves. This is kind of just one of the things that people do. So if you were to look at the bottom here, we have the slave class doing things like pulling plows, things like building walls. Walls were, were going to become incredibly important for fortifying your city against an attack from, maybe the Gutian barbarians at the perimeter, or from, just another city, maybe the Akkadians, marching in, or a rebellious city. Being able to have a wall around your city was important, and so the slave class would be tasked with building the bricks and then carrying the bricks and building the walls that were around the cities. But both agriculture and construction do require some kind of managerial direction, and so we do have this middle class that's up here. Middle class almost always includes warriors. Warriors are people who are armed by definition, and so they cannot be pushed around quite as easily as you might be able to push around unarmed, half-drunken slaves. And then we have people who have skilled labor. Look at this guy performing, or maybe it's a girl, making pottery. And so pottery is important. Being able to build these things is important, but it takes skill. It's something that you can't get good at in an afternoon, whereas digging a ditch or carrying a load of bricks is something that you don't need a lot of skill in order to do. And then especially here in the center right, we have scribes, people who were literate, people who could read and write and transcribe messages from this district to that, or from this city to that, and be able to read and carry out these commands. And then at the top you have the Lugal, and again, this would be his family or his friends or people that he had elevated to a status where their labor is no longer something that they have to worry about. These middle-class professions, or I shouldn't be calling them middle class technically, but let's say these client or commoner professions that are skilled would not just be things like pottery, which was very important, but think of the man who has to construct the chariots or the war cars, the cartwheels. They have to have skill. They have to have the type of knowledge that might take months or years to develop. And so conquering someone whose language you don't speak and ordering them to build a chariot for you is not something that you would be able to do. And then one of the most important skilled professions would be that of smelting, that of smithing. And especially, we call this entire period the Bronze Age. And bronze is it's an alloy of two metals. It's an alloy of copper and tin. And so you'll be able to find these things individually, but then they have to be brought to the same location. So the ore has to be mined out of the earth. That might be something that a slave class is able to do under the direction of a manager. But the copper and the tin have to be brought to the same location and heated to the degree that they melt and mixed in the right proportions, and then smithed into the implements of war or of agriculture or of just whatever it is that you need them to be used for. So smithing and pottering and carpentrying were all things that a commoner or client class would have been responsible for. You also have the largest industry. You could consider agriculture an industry. It definitely is, but the largest and most important industry in Sumer and these Mesopotamian and even non-Mesopotamian ancient cultures, most important industry would have been textiles, the creation of fabric. And so when I think of fabric, a lot of times I think of cotton. They would have grown a lot of flax in order to create linen. Linen is a thinner fabric, more fitting to the climate, but This flax needs to be grown, again, a job which might be able to be done by a slave class, but then it has to be, you have to be able to extract the fibers, to spin it into thread, to weave all of that thread on a loom. These are some examples here in the middle of an ancient way of creating a loom. And then once you have that fabric, you need to sew it into the forms that you want it. You need to dye it. Like I said, they weren't all just wearing white or beige. Especially the wealthy would have distinguished themselves by wearing blues and reds and yellows and purples. Purple is especially thought of as a royal color. Perhaps not so much what we think of when we think of purple, but more like a deep royal or navy blue. And then again, one of the most difficult skills to develop, but a skill that would have made your labor very valuable, is the skill of reading and writing. And so you would have these adubas, tablet houses, kind of schools where, starting at an early age, the children of people who did have some kind of wealth and power would be able to go and labor away. So they had the privilege of not pulling a plow or digging in a mine or working in a flax or wheat field, but instead sitting in these shaded buildings and being taught by an instructor how to write out their syllabary. And then eventually they would be used for transcribing, for sending messages. This cuneiform script became very, very complicated. In the English language, we have 26 letters, we have 10 digits, and we have some punctuation marks, but they did not have an alphabet. They had rather a syllabary, which means that you have a different, instead of just having an A and a B and a E and an I and a U, you would have an ab, a ba, an eb, a be, an ib, a bi, an ub, and a buh. And copy that for every single consonant, right? So you would have a ad and da, ed and de, id and di, ud and duh. And then add on top of this, to make it just even more ludicrously complicated, the fact that at least Sumerian was a tonal language, which meant that your inflection, if you said be or be, all three of those would have had different meanings. There are still many tonal languages today. Most notable would be like Mandarin Chinese. The difference between your inflection affects the meaning. Whereas in English, if I say dog or dog, all three of those just mean dog, and so I don't have to worry about that. So Sumerian was a very brutally complicated language, not only to speak, but which can be learned, pretty much passively, as long as you're raised in that society. But in order to write it down and to read it and faithfully be able to interpret it and to carry out orders based on written directions was something that took years and years to accomplish. So we have schools today, even in America, but you're considered functionally illiterate if you can read at about a third grade level, which means that by the time that you're 8, you would have already accomplished most of the reading and writing that instruction manuals or employers are going to require of you. Now, that's a third grade reading level. Not saying that all third graders or even all high schoolers are able to read at that level. However, it would make you a functioning citizen if you could. So, it's just like in any society. The less skilled your labor is, the less valuable it is to society. But if you teach yourself a skill, if you learn or develop a skill like weaving or carpentry or you think in Sumeria, just literacy, being able to read and write, then your labor becomes more valuable. You can acquire more resources for yourself, and you can plan into the future for the collection of those resources and the direction of those resources, and your family for generations can benefit from that. So like I said, these aren't necessarily structures that are unique to the Sumerians or even to the Middle East. When we think of skilled labor being more valuable than unskilled labor, or just something that a job that you can learn to do in an afternoon, that's still the case in America today, or in modern culture today. When we think of a king or a ruling class, that's something that we still carry today. It's just, the culture might change slowly, but the societal structures that have developed have stayed largely just because they are the ones that work. And when you try to do things in a way that doesn't work, your civilization falls, and you might have a written record of the things that you did, but a stronger civilization that has its act together can come in and take the resources that you left behind. So that's lecture number 2. We'll have one more on Sumeria, and that's specifically going to be talking about religion and even more specifically the Epic of Gilgamesh and the place that that took in the psychology of the average Sumerian, both king and slave and everybody in between. But for now, that's all that I have for you. Thank you for listening. God bless. Have a great day.